What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here, and in this video, I'll be teaching you what every fragment does in Destiny 2. If you've watched my subclass school videos, then you already know this information, but if not, then this will be the perfect primer to get you ready for build crafting with Prismatic when the final shape releases. They've already previewed some of the Prismatic fragments, and a lot of them are just a combination of two different fragments from the current subclasses. So having the in-depth knowledge of how all the fragments work will be crucial to build crafting with Prismatic. We have a lot to go over, so let's jump right into it. We'll just go with the subclasses in alphabetical order, starting with Arc and finishing with Void. We'll be breaking down all the Arc fragments. There are 16 in total, and we'll just go in alphabetical order. So without further ado, let's take a look at the first fragment, which is Spark of Amplitude. It states, rapidly defeating targets while you are amplified creates an orb of power. This is a great fragment as you are usually amplified on Arc, and it's very easy to do mass ad clear on Arc. The problem is, there is a 10-second cooldown on this fragment. So once you create an orb of power, then you will not be able to make another one for 10 seconds. But it is very easy to activate. You just need to kill a couple enemies when the cooldown is off, and you will make an orb that grants you 2.5% super energy. Up next is Spark of Beacons. This fragment states, while you are amplified, your Arc special weapon final blows create a blinding explosion. This literally works on any special weapon. This is a strong fragment because blind is such a powerful verb. However, the radius isn't too large on the explosion, so you will only get good mileage out of this fragment if you're using it in very ad dense activities. Spark of Brilliance is next, and it states, defeating a blinded target with precision damage creates a blinding explosion. Gives plus 10 to intellect. The compendium estimates the blinding blast to be about 3 meters. So again, while this is a strong fragment thanks to the strength of blind, you need to get a crit kill on an enemy that's already blinded. So this fragment can work in very specific builds if you are kind of built around using this fragment. It requires having a weapon that can secure easy crit kills, so a precision style weapon, and you need to have a build that can blind things pretty frequently. There are not a ton of sources of blind in the game, so you really won't get a lot of mileage out of this one. Spark of Discharge is next, and it states, Arc weapon final blows have a chance to create an ionic trace. Minus 10 to strength. So this is a great fragment thanks to how strong ionic traces are. They work on a counter, so you need 3 red bar kills to get this to activate. Elites grant 67% towards the counter, so like 1 red bar and 1 elite, and then mini bosses and bosses always make a trace. And guardians are also 67% of the counter. So if you are planning on running Arc weapons with your build, then this will be a great fragment to run. Spark of Feedback is next. Taking melee damage briefly increases your outgoing melee damage, plus 10 to resilience. So this gives a 75% increase to melee damage in PvE and 50% in PvP. It works on regular melees and charge melees, and it also stacks with all other damage buffs. So something like Combination Blow with 1-2 Punch, it all stacks so it can hit incredibly hard. It's great for melee based loadouts like Assassin's Cowl Hunter or Liar's Handshake. Or even something like Insurmountable Skullfort on Titan, but it can only be activated on a melee hit from an enemy, and those are sometimes awkward to get to proc depending on the enemy type. So it is more of a passive fragment that will give you a nice boost to your damage when you do take some melee damage from an enemy. Spark of Focus is next. This states, after sprinting for a short time, your class ability regen is increased. So this gives minus 10 to the stat that governs your class ability. So recovery on Warlock, mobility on Hunter, and resilience on Titan. The compendium states, after 1.25 seconds of sprinting, and while maintaining both sprint and movement speed of 5 meters per second or higher, you will get 150% additional base class ability regen rate, or 75% in PvP. And then it says sprinting into a wall will instantly deactivate Spark of Focus, and it deactivates when your class ability is full. So on my Warlock, I cast a Rift with tier 7 recovery, and then proc this, and I got a Rift back in 31 seconds, when it would normally take 59 seconds with tier 7 recovery. I did lose Spark of Focus briefly because I ran into a crack in the ground. The reason that this is that is how it is coded in Destiny so that it wouldn't work by sprinting into walls. Again, you have to maintain sprinting speed. So even when you turn sharply, you will lose Spark of Focus, as you can see when I'm doing it on my Hunter. I tested this on my Titan to see if it would still work if I had tier 10 resilience. So I had 100 resilience on a towering barricade, which is normally a 41 second cooldown, and I'm able to get my barricade back in just 23 seconds. So yes, it works even if you have 100 on your class ability stat. Spark of Frequency states melee hits greatly increase your reload speed for a short duration. So this one is very straightforward. Get any melee hit, regular or charged, and you will get a plus 50 reload speed and a 0.8x reload multiplier for 5 seconds. Again, very simple and straightforward. Spark of Haste is similar to Spark of Focus, just worse. It states you have greatly increased resilience, recovery, and mobility while sprinting, and it deactivates in the same way if you run into a wall or something that slows your momentum down like a sharp turn. So with Haste, you get plus 20 mobility, recovery, and resilience. So it's like, okay, I guess some more recov can be nice if you're running for your life, but this one does not go past tier 10 overall. So at tier 10 Resil on a Titan, my Towering Barricade will be 41 seconds regardless. But if I ran tier 8, then it would take it from 50 seconds down to 41. Where with Focus, you can go above and beyond that base cooldown. So this one is more just for a passive increase to your top 3 stats, which I don't think is that valuable personally. Especially since you have to be sprinting to receive those benefits. If these gave you 100 overall for all 3 stats, I think it still wouldn't be all that great. The recovery would certainly be very nice, as you could run from enemies to regen your health faster with 100 recovery, but with mobility, it's like, wow, okay, I can jump higher now with more mobility, but only when I sprint. Cool. So yeah, not a great fragment in my opinion. Next is Spark of Instinct. While critically wounded, taking damage emits a burst of damaging arc energy that jolts targets. So basically, once you get into red health, you will emit a burst that damages and jolts targets. And there's a 15-second cooldown on this, so that is what really hurts it. Like yeah, the burst of damage is nice if you get caught with a bunch of enemies around you, but it will only save you once every 15 seconds. And in higher end content, you are more likely going to die anyways if you're surrounded by a bunch of ads. The burst it emits doesn't do very much damage at all. I think it would be better if it blinded enemies, because then at least you could get out without being shot at. So in my opinion, this fragment could use a rework or a buff. Lower the cooldown to 10 seconds and make it blind instead of jolt, and we might have something here. Next is Spark of Ions. Very simple. Defeating a jolted target creates an ionic trace. It is quite easy to jolt targets with arc builds, so this is a strong fragment, so to keep it balanced, they have a 10-second cooldown so you can't make a ton of ionic traces for defeating jolted targets. But it's still a decent fragment. Next is Spark of Magnitude. Your lingering arc grenades have extended duration. So I will just show some side-by-sides of a regular lightning, pulse, and storm grenade versus the souped up versions from Spark of Magnitude. Next is Spark of Momentum. Sliding over ammo bricks reloads your equipped weapon and grants a small amount of melee energy. Inertia Override, look what they did to my boy. This used to be part of the perk tree on Middle Tree Striker Titan, and it would allow you to get a damage boost. It was absolutely awesome in PvP. Now it gives melee energy instead and reloads your equipped weapon only. You get 20% melee energy on a special brick pickup and 50% melee energy from a heavy brick. So not really worth running at all in my opinion, in PvE or PvP. Spark of Recharge is next. It states, while critically wounded, your melee and grenade energy regenerates more quickly. This is a wonderful fragment. Remember how Spark of Focus gave us 150% increased regen speed to our class ability? Well, this gives us 400% additional base grenade and melee regen rate, and 200% in PvP. This allows our grenade and melee cooldowns to be reduced substantially. Then when you combine this with the ability energy that you get back from ionic traces, you can have some super quick cooldowns on your abilities. It is a passive bonus though. You don't necessarily want to be in red bar health very often, but it is going to happen from time to time, and when it does, this fragment helps a lot. It's really good in PvP too, where if you are in a 1v1, you will often get down to low health in that engagement. I like this fragment. It's kind of high risk, high reward. Next is Spark of Resistance. This states, while surrounded by combatants, you are more resistant to incoming damage, gives plus 10 to strength. So this one is pretty strong. It gives 25% damage resistance when within 15 meters of 3 enemies, and it lingers for 2 seconds. So basically, you just get greater damage resistance when you're in the fray. It's great on builds that have you in the heat of the action. And in PvP, it's only 10% damage resistance, but this is more of a PvE fragment in my opinion, and a good one at that. Spark of Shock is next. Your grenade jolts targets, minus 10 to discipline. Another very straightforward fragment. Your grenades now apply jolt. This is damn near a must run for me, as jolt is such a great verb, and with the way you can spam abilities on some arc builds, you can have grenades applying jolt extremely often. And that brings us to the final fragment, Spark of Volts. Finishers make you amplified, plus 10 to recovery. So it's exactly how it sounds. Do a finisher, get amplified. There is no cooldown on it or anything. But not a very good fragment, because getting amplified on arc is extremely easy to do on pretty much any arc build. So next up we have Solar. First up we have Ember of Ashes. The in-game description for this is very simple. You apply more scorch stacks to targets. Now, I recently did a video breaking down all the solar verbs, so check that out for way more info on how Scorch works. But basically, what Ember of Ashes does is it allows you to apply more Scorch stacks whatever your application is. So the Destiny Data Compendium has a good description for us. They say that as a rule, Scorch stacks applied are increased by 50%. So if something applies 30 Scorch at base, it would then apply 45. This is how the Celestial Fire melee works. It shoots 3 homing bolts, and each bolt applies 10 stacks of Scorch, but that is increased to 15 with Ember of Ashes. So if you land the whole melee, it would be 30 Scorch stacks without Ashes, and 45 Scorch stacks with it. There are a few exceptions to this rule, but for the most part, that is how it works. Polaris Lance is great with this because at base it applies 40 Scorch stacks with the perfect 5th shot, but with Ember of Ashes, it applies 60. So even outside of this season, it is able to cause ignitions in just 2 perfect 5th shots, which is extremely powerful. So next we have Ember of Beams. Your solar super projectiles have stronger target acquisition, and it gives us plus 10 to our intellect stat. According to the compendium, this currently only works with Daybreak projectiles and Blade Barrage knives. So if you played before Solar 3.0, you may remember Bottom Tree Dawnblade had tracking on its projectiles, so it sort of works like that. It is hard to visually show off, but this is what it is supposed to do, is it just makes it easier to hit your shots with the super projectiles. And RIP to Hammer Titans who apparently don't get the tracking hammers. Next we have Ember of Benevolence. I'll be honest, I was sleeping on this fragment for a long time, but depending on your build, this could be absolutely fantastic. The in-game description is applying Restoration, Cure, or Radiant to allies grants increased grenade, melee, and class ability regeneration for a short duration. It also gives minus 10 to the Discipline stat. The Destiny Data Compendium shows us some notable exceptions that do not work with this, which is unfortunate. But some things it does work with is Well of Radiance, Healing Rifts, Lumina's Blessing, Noble Seekers from Boots of the Assembler, and the Healing Seekers from the class-specific Warlock Glaive, Edge of Intent. So this fragment is great on a Solar Warlock who wants to take the support role for the team. And what it does is it grants an additional 400% energy regen to your base grenade, melee, and class ability regen rates for 6 seconds. It's important to note that this is based on base regen rate. So take solar grenades for instance. At base they have a 2-minute 32-second cooldown, which is 152 seconds. A 400% increase would only be a 38-second cooldown. That is a minute and 54 seconds faster than your base cooldown. However, the Benevolence buff only lasts for 6 seconds. So you would have to proc it about 6 times to get your solar grenade back in 38 seconds. But that may be easier than you think. If a teammate is in your Well of Radiance or Healing Rift, you only get Ember of Benevolence for 6 seconds. But if they step in and out every so often, the buff will keep refreshing. So yes, you have to rely on your teammates knowing about this interaction if you run this fragment, but that is what this video is for. So show it to your friends so that they have a good understanding of exactly what the fragments do. Again, the buff only lasts for 6 seconds and only 3 seconds in PvP, but if you have a build that can supply constant healing like Lumina and Boots of the Assembler, then you will be able to get a ton of ability energy back. Next, we have Ember of Blistering. Defeating targets with solar ignitions grants grenade energy. This one is fairly straightforward. Kill things with ignitions, get grenade energy. The Destiny Data Compendium gives us some good info on this. You get 8% for a red bar, 12.25% for an orange bar, 16.5% for a yellow bar and I believe champions, 20.75% for guardians in PvP, and 25% for mini bosses. So this fragment would be really good in ad dense nightfalls like battlegrounds, as there are lots of enemies that are grouped up that you can kill with ignitions. Next is Ember of Char. Your solar ignition spreads scorch to affected targets. It also gives us plus 10 to discipline. This is fairly self-explanatory. If you have an ignition based build, then this is great to run as it can sometimes cause ignitions to chain, which has potential for incredible ad clear. It applies 40 scorch to enemies that don't die from the ignition, and 60 if you have Ember of Ashes. This makes it easier to proc another ignition right away as you are already halfway to another ignition. Ember of Combustion states final blows with a solar super cause targets to ignite and create a fire sprite, and it gives us plus 10 to strength. This can be very powerful depending on the content and the type of build that you're using. Say you are on Hammer Titan, one hammer can kill an enemy and cause an ignition, making it great for ad clear. Or on a Warlock, Well of Radiance converts your weapon damage into super damage. This means every solar weapon kill will cause an ignition. This is super powerful for ad clear, especially with a Phoenix Protocol Warlock. This does not work with non-solar weapons, but it does work with osmosis weapons if you make them solar. It also does not work with teammates' Well of Radiance. I tested it with a friend's well and they had Ember of Combustion equipped and I did as well, and I was not able to cause ignitions with my solar weapons. This was expected though because with a well it converts the caster's weapon damage into super damage. This synergy has existed for years, so I doubt it is changing anytime soon. But this is definitely a good interaction to know about. And again, this will allow any solar super to cause ignitions with kills. I just wanted to point out the additional interaction that it has with Well of Radiance. Ember of Empyrean states solar weapon or ability final blows extend the duration of restoration and radiant effects applied to you. Gives minus 10 to resilience. So this fragment got reworked and I had to go back and retest things as a result. It was nerfed in some ways and buffed in others. It used to give a flat 4 seconds of extension for every enemy you killed, and it would go up to 12 seconds. Well, with the rework, it now gives different time extensions based on the tier of enemy killed. You can see the different values on screen thanks to the Destiny Data Compendium. What is great about the rework though, is that the timer can now go up to 15 seconds. So overall, it's still one of the absolute strongest fragments in the entire game, allowing you to have nearly permanent restoration and radiant if you play your build properly. It's extremely powerful. Ember of Eruption grants us plus 10 strength and states that our solar ignitions have increased AoE. This is extremely hard to measure in game, so we will look to the compendium and the experts say it is roughly a 20% increased radius. Again, this is really good on ignition based builds. Why not get bigger explosions if your build is built around ignitions? Ember of Mercy gives us plus 10 to resilience and states, when you revive an ally, you and other nearby allies gain restoration. Picking up a fire sprite grants restoration. So we once again have a fragment that recently got reworked. This fragment is now much better. It used to reset your restoration timer back to 2 seconds when you'd pick up a fire sprite, but now it will just give you 2 more seconds of restoration when you pick up a fire sprite, or 3 seconds with Ember of Solace equipped. This fragment is now much stronger as a result, because if you play your build right, you can have an almost on-demand way to get restoration without needing to run healing grenades. I have a very awesome build in mind with this fragment now that it's fixed. I'm so happy this issue was finally resolved, as it's been in the game for almost 2 years now, ever since Solar 3.0 came out. So I'm happily grabbing new footage and editing the script and video as a result. Ember of Resolve allows your solar grenade final blows to cure you. I love this with Sunbracer Warlock, as it allows you to get cured quite often because your grenades get so many kills. So you'll just randomly get these 60 HP bumps to your health. It's really nice and it's definitely saved my life a time or two. So it can certainly be good depending on the content and build that you're running. I tried with Armamentarium Titan to throw 2 grenades back to back, and there does seem to be a slight cooldown to the health that it gives back. And it only gives health back on 1 kill per grenade. So if you take out a bunch of enemies with 1 grenade, you're still only getting 1 60 HP chunk to your health, not like 10 chunks. Ember of Searing gives plus 10 to recovery and states defeating a scorched target grants melee energy and creates a fire sprite. This is exceptionally strong this season thanks to Flint Striker. This one grants energy based on the tier of the combatant killed. So tier 1 is 8%, tier 2 is 15%, 3 is 17.5%, guardians are 20%, and tier 4 combatants are 25%. You can see just how quickly I'm getting my throwing knife back in the background gameplay. Absolutely love this fragment on my consecration build on Titan. You can have nearly infinite melees if you are killing big groups of adds. Check that video out after this if you want. It's one of my favorite builds in the game right now. Ember of Singeing is very similar, but you don't even need a kill. You just have to scorch a target. It states your class ability recharges faster when you scorch targets. The compendium states that this is a 300% increase from your base ability recharge rate, and it lasts for 3 seconds. But if you are scorching tons of targets, then you will have this up very frequently. The Radiant Dodge has a pretty long base cooldown at 1 minute and 22 seconds, but with this fragment, I'm able to get it back in about 18 seconds. So this is pretty strong, especially on Warlocks for getting lots of rifts. Ember of Solace states Radiant and Restoration effects applied to you have increased duration. So basically, this makes any of these effects last 50% longer. So if you get 4 seconds of Restoration from a healing grenade, this will take it to 6. If you get 10 seconds of Radiant from your Acrobat dodge, this will make it 15, and so on. Ember of Tempering is next, and it is a long one. It states Solar Weapon Final Blows grant you and allies increased recovery for a short duration. While Tempered Metal is active, your weapons have increased airborne effectiveness. While Ember of Tempering is active, Solar Weapon Final Blows create a fire sprite, and it gives you -10 to recovery. This one took a while to test, but the compendium says it grants +10 recovery for you and allies within 12.5 meters for 8 seconds. Stacks up to ×3. While active, you get +20 AE and solar weapon kills spawn a fire sprite. So I wanted to see if you got 10 recovery per stack, because it stacks to ×3, and that appears to be exactly how it works. I set my recovery stat to 70 on a Warlock, and then tested 1 stack, 2 stacks, and 3 stacks. And then I timed how long it took me to get my Rift, and these times coincided with the results on the Destiny data compendium for Rift cooldown rates at different recovery tiers. Additionally, I thought this might increase the higher stacks that we go, so I also took my recovery to 40 and tested 3 stacks, and it gave me a Rift cooldown that matches with tier 7. So I can conclude that this gives us +10 recovery for every stack of Ember of Tempering. So this is definitely best for Warlock, as if you have a solar based weapon loadout, then you could run 70 recovery but effectively have 100. It obviously benefits the other classes as well because better health recovery is always nice, but it is best for Warlock because their class ability stat is governed by their recovery stat. Next is Ember of Torches, which is another one of the strongest fragments in the game, especially on Solar Bonk Titan. It states powered melee attacks against combatants make you and nearby allies radiant, gives -10 to discipline. So all you have to do is land a melee attack and you will make yourself and nearby allies radiant for 8 seconds. Your allies have to be within 8 meters of you to get this buff. And again, it doesn't even have to be a kill, just a melee hit. And this will be 12 seconds of radiant if you have Ember of Solace on. And that brings us to the final fragment, Ember of Wonder. This gives +10 to resilience and says rapidly defeating multiple targets with solar ignitions generates an orb of power. Sadly, there's a 10-second cooldown on this one, otherwise you could make an insane number of orbs every time you get an ignition. But I guess that is how they keep it balanced. Because of this cooldown, I don't overly think this fragment is worth running. Next is Stasis. We'll start with Whisper of Bonds. This fragment states defeating frozen targets generates an orb of power, but much like Ember of Wonder, there is of course a 10-second cooldown before you can make another orb. This is done for the sake of balance, as you could make a crap ton of orbs otherwise. One important thing to note is that if you kill the enemy outright, like from a Penumbral Blast melee, before it has a chance to actually be frozen, then it won't create an orb of power. But that is pretty much all there is to know with this fragment. It's pretty straightforward. It also gives you -10 to your intellect stat. Moving on, we have Whisper of Chains. This states that while you are near frozen targets or a friendly stasis crystal, you take reduced damage from targets. So here is one of those cases where I rely on the Destiny data compendium. They state that it gives you 40% damage resistance and only 5% in PvP. It also gives you +10 to your recovery stat. So this could be nice for survivability and higher end content. Next we have Whisper of Conduction. This one is very straightforward. It states nearby stasis shards track to your position. It gives +10 to resilience and intellect. So if you have a build based around making shards, then this is very nice as you don't have to run around and collect them. The compendium states that they track when you are within 15 meters of them, which is a pretty decent distance. So this is definitely a quality of life fragment. Next we have Whisper of Durance. Slows from your abilities last longer. For those abilities that linger, their duration will increase. Gives plus 10 to strength. So unlike Ember of Ashes, which generally increases Scorch by 1.5 times or 50%, this one is on a case-by-case basis. So throughout the rest of the subclass school, when you see the compendium info, this will have a small plus sign that indicates how much longer it will last with this fragment equipped. So for a Duskfield Grenade, I found that at base it lasts for 7 seconds, and with Durance it lasts for 10. A Bleakwatcher turret lasts for 25 seconds at base, but with Durance it lasts for 30. This is a very nice fragment for any build that's based around slow, so it's really good on something like a Renewal Grasps Hunter. Next is Whisper of Fissures. Increases the damage and size of the burst of stasis when you destroy a stasis crystal or defeat a frozen target. So this one is extremely difficult to measure because the damage of a crystal explosion will depend on the enemy's proximity to it, and this is hard to do consistently. So the Destiny Data Compendium says shattering enemies or crystals deals an additional damage instance, dealing up to 25 damage in a 10-meter radius. So even this is kind of confusing. So first, let me say that if you have a build that is based around shattering stasis crystals, you should definitely use this, especially on something like a Behemoth Titan who is all about making crystals. But to visually show the damage increase is quite difficult, but this clip shows it quite well. So I freeze Carl and shatter the ice, and it deals 19,880 damage from the sniper shot and 11,392 from the shatter, and then an additional 1424 damage. Then I take fissures off and do the same thing, and I do not get the 1424 damage number, but the others stay the same. So we deal an extra 12.5% damage based off the shatter damage, which is what the compendium states. As for the extra AoE of the shatters, like I said, it's quite hard to measure, but again, it's very good to run if you have a build based around shattering crystals. Moving on, we have Whisper of Fractures. This states your melee energy recharges faster when you are near 2 or more targets, gives minus 10 to discipline. So the compendium says that you must be within 15 meters of 2 or more enemies. So you will get 2.5% melee energy every second if you're around 2 enemies, and 5% per second if you're around 3 or more. The melee gains you get back from this fragment are quite impressive. Like 5% per second would get your melee back in 20 seconds without any passive cooldown. That's quite strong. That being said, most stasis melees are not that good, but it is a strong fragment for what it does. Next is Whisper of Hedrons. This states dramatically increases weapon stability, weapon aim assist, weapon airborne effectiveness, mobility, resilience, and recovery after freezing a target with stasis. And the compendium gives us the data. It grants us a stat boost for 11 seconds every time we freeze an enemy. I put this on with Osmiomancy Cold Snaps, and every time the Cold Snap froze a new enemy, the timer would reset. It says it gives you plus 60 to mobility, resilience, and recovery. So this thing is amazing for filling out your stats as long as you are always freezing stuff. But if you are running low resilience in a GM, you may not want to rely on this because it's quite unpredictable. It also boosts those stats, which helps your cooldown on certain characters. So on Warlock, you could run 40 recovery, but if you are always getting freezes off, you would effectively always have 100 recovery, so your Rift cooldown would only be 48 seconds instead of 75 seconds, provided you're able to keep Hedrons active pretty much the whole time. This is very powerful. Same goes for a Hunter Dodge. You could run 40 mobility and you would have close to 100 if you keep Hedrons up a lot, and also for your Titan Barricade. As for other stats, it gives you 30 stability, 15 aim assist, and 20 airborne effectiveness. So overall, a pretty good fragment depending on your build. It gives a lot of benefits. Next is Whisper of Hunger. This states increases the melee energy gained from picking up stasis shards. If you watch my stasis verbs breakdown, you will know these give 10% melee energy from a small shard and 50% from a large shard. Well, this takes it to 17.5% energy for a small, and 75% for a large. This is actually really strong. But again, the problem is that stasis melees just aren't that good. But again, the fragment itself is very good at what it does. You get super huge melee gains. As a result, Bungie made it so this gives minus 20 to your strength stat, but the gains you get from picking up shards way more than offset this. Next is Whisper of Impetus. This gives plus 10 to resilience and states damaging targets with a stasis melee reloads your stowed weapons and grants you a temporary boost to weapon ready speed. In the background gameplay, you can see me on a hunter with 6 Coyote and Marksman's Dodge, and I dumped 14 rockets in about 14 seconds. This fragment is great on Hunter because they get 2 Withering Blade melees, meaning they can use this fragment to reload their weapons quite easily. The downside is, much like Threat of Ascent or Demolitionist, there is a cooldown. So when you proc it, you get Nimble Arsenal on a 5-second timer, but if you try to re-proc it before the timer runs out, it doesn't work. So you have to be aware of that. But it is great for damage rotations as it also gives increased handling. Plus 40 to the handling stat of all your weapons, so it's great for DPS swap rotations. And it reloads all your weapons, not just your equipped one. So you could dump like a full 4th Horseman with the right setup on a Hunter. But even if you were just using it in a day-to-day build, it's still nice to have. Sometimes you're being rushed by enemies in a GM and all your weapons aren't reloaded. Well, you can just chuck out a melee and boom, everything is reloaded and ready to go. So it's not a bad fragment at all. Next is Whisper of Refraction. Defeating slowed or frozen targets grants you class ability energy. So this is based on the tier of enemy defeated. You can see all the values on screen now. I was very impressed with this fragment. I got 4 rifts back in about a minute and I was not even fully optimized for this. If you were running this on a Bleakwatcher Warlock, you could have your rift up almost constantly. But it can work on any character. So it's great for Hunter for getting your dodge back, and for Titan for getting barricades as well. Which is great on something like a Cadmus Ridge Lancecap Titan, as you could have a rally barricade up basically all the time. Or run it with Hoarfrost Z for a ton of stasis barricades. Again, a very good fragment at what it does, but you really need to be built around using your class ability to get the most use out of it. Whisper of Rending is next. Primary ammo weapons do increased damage to stasis crystals and frozen targets. So again, if you watch the stasis verbs video, you will know primary weapons do 5% less damage to frozen combatants. But with Whisper of Rending, this is increased by 50%. So my auto rifle normally hits for 15-19 damage when a target is frozen, and now it hits for 22-78 damage. So this is a very powerful fragment. And it also works in PvP. My auto rifle hits for 23 to the body and 41 to the head. Then when frozen, it only hits for 9 to the body and 17 to the head. Drastically less damage. But when we put on Whisper of Rending, it hits for 14 to the body and 25 to the head. Because of rounding, this works out to a 50% damage increase, which is the same as PvE. So that is great to know and something you'll definitely want to consider if you are running Stasis in PvP. Also, big shout out to my buddy Baker for helping me test that. I also want to point out a special interaction because I know people have asked if it stacks. So here's Verglas Curve. Nowhere on the weapon does it say it does more damage to frozen targets, but it does. So at base on Carl, we hit for 11,724 damage. Then when he is frozen, we hit for 16,707. This is a 42.5% damage increase. But then we throw on Whisper of Rending, and now we hit for 25,060 damage. This is a 50% damage increase from the first damage increase, so they stack multiplicatively, meaning the total damage increase is 2.1375x, or 114% more damage. So if you're running this bow, then I highly recommend running Whisper of Rending. It also gets a quicker draw time when you freeze enemies. It's just a great bow, and it's awesome with this fragment. And I'm not even done. It also takes less shots to break a crystal with this fragment. So without Rending, it takes me 4 shots to break a small crystal, 5 to break a medium crystal, and 6 to break a large crystal. With Whisper of Rending, it only takes 2 shots from this auto rifle to break any of these crystals. So that is pretty great. And this buff also works for Revision 0 and Vex Mythoclast in their alternate fire modes because they are still primary damage weapons. So something like Wishender, which hits very hard too, is great with this. And I want to point out one more amazing weapon that this works with, and that is Quicksilver Storm. So at base, the grenade hits for 72,000 damage, and then 68,000 when frozen, but we do get some shatter damage, so the total is like 80,000. But then we put on Whisper of Rending, and it does a whopping 102,786 damage, plus the shatter damage to push it up to like 115,000. That is absurd damage for any weapon, let alone a primary. So yeah, depending on your weapon loadout, this fragment can be ridiculous. Alright, that was a long one, but I wanted to really showcase how powerful that fragment can be in the right situation. The next fragment is Whisper of Rime, which states collecting a stasis shard grants a small amount of overshield, which falls off after 10 seconds. Collecting additional shards adds to the overshield and refreshes the timer. So you need to collect 10 small shards to get a full overshield. Each small shard gives 5 HP, so it is a 50 HP overshield. And large shards will give about 35 HP back. If you don't have full health, then these will replenish your health bar instead. And according to the compendium, the overshield gives 50% damage resistance as well. So here's a clip of combining Whisper of Rhyme and Whisper of Chains, and you can see it takes Carl quite a while to kill us with this combo. Whisper of Shards states shattering a stasis crystal temporarily boosts your grenade recharge rate. Shattering additional stasis crystals increases the duration of this benefit. So each crystal you destroy gives you 5 seconds of improved ability regeneration, and this can go up to 10 seconds. And while this timer is active, you get a 500% increase to your base grenade regen rate. This is actually 6 and 11 seconds if you want to get technical, because the timer lingers for 1 second on 0. Regardless, the improved ability regen rate is substantial to say the least. I love running this fragment on my Osmiomancy Bleakwatcher build. We can use Vergloss Curve to make crystals and then break those crystals for great AoE ad clear and huge grenade uptime. This is just a great fragment. And that brings us to the final fragment, Whisper of Torment. This one is simple. You gain grenade energy each time you take damage from targets. So there's a 1 second cooldown between grenade energy gains. When you take damage, you get a 5% bump to your grenade energy, and it's a 10% bump if you are in critical health. So this mod is certainly very strong, but it's also quite risky because ideally you do not want to be taking a bunch of damage. But taking damage is often inevitable, so getting little chunks of grenade energy every time you do is a nice passive buff. And next we have Strand. So we will start with Thread of Ascent. This fragment is very simple. It states activating your grenade ability reloads your equipped weapon and grants bonus airborne effectiveness and handling for a short duration. It also gives plus 10 to our mobility stat. So the Destiny Data Compendium gives us a bit more info. It grants us plus 30 handling, plus 40 reload speed, and a 0.925x reload multiplier, and it gives us 30 airborne effectiveness for 15 seconds. And importantly, it incurs a 4-second cooldown between ammo refills. Meaning if you have a grapple tangle to constantly grapple to reload your weapon, say in a rocket dumping DPS scenario, then you will not be able to reload it until the 4-second timer has deactivated. But this is still a strategy that many teams employ for optimal DPS, and it only reloads your equipped weapon, not all your weapons. Next up we have Thread of Binding, which states super final blows emit a suspending burst from the target, grants plus 10 resilience. Now, I love this fragment on the Hunter Super Silk Strike because it's an ad clear super, so with this fragment, the super will suspend enemies near the ones that you just hit. This allows you to do tremendous ad clear while suspending a bunch of targets so you don't get killed by them while you're ad clearing. However, on Titan and especially Warlock, I don't find it quite as useful. Thread of Continuity states suspend, unravel, and sever effects applied to targets have increased duration. So it basically just buffs the Strand debuffs by making them last longer. Generally, this buff is about 50%. When we look at Suspend, the duration depends on the enemy type. So Guardians will be 2 seconds without it and 3 seconds with it. Most enemies will be 5 seconds without and 7 seconds with. And then Champions and mini-bosses are 3 seconds without and 4 seconds with. The duration of Sever goes from 10 seconds to 15 seconds and from 5 to 7.5 in PvP. And I couldn't get any concrete data on Unravel because Unravel reprocs itself every time it activates. So it stays on an enemy for a very long time, usually until they die unless it's a boss. But I did test it with unraveling rounds to see if it extends it there, and it does not. And I think it should. So Bungie, if you happen to see this, please make that change happen. Because right now, it really doesn't do anything for Unravel given how the verb works. And if you aren't sure how it works, then check out my video on the Strand verbs when you're done with this one. In fact, you should probably check it out first if you don't know what they do, because I will refer to those verbs a lot in this video. So long story short, Thread of Continuity increases the duration of your Strand debuffs. Thread of Evolution is the next one. This allows your threadlings to travel further and deal additional damage. The compendium says they travel about 30% faster and further, and they deal 33% increased damage in PvE, and then 10% increased damage in PvP. So in practice, at base they hit for 14,800 damage on Carl, and with Thread of Evolution they hit for 19,684. And then in Crucible, at base they hit for 36 damage, and then 39 with Evolution. This is an 8.3% damage increase, but Destiny also has lots of rounding that goes on, so we will chalk it up to a rounding error and trust the Compendium's info. Also, keep in mind that the health pools were changed in Crucible on March 5th, so that may also have something to do with it. Next is Thread of Finality. Very simple. Finisher final blows create threadlings, and it gives us plus 10 to recovery. There's literally nothing else to it. You do a finisher, you make a threadling, and there's no cooldown on this one, so you can make lots of threadlings if you're constantly doing finishers. But this isn't the most efficient way to play, so this fragment in my eyes needs some type of buff. Maybe it could make 2 or 3 threadlings on a finisher, or have some other functionality on top of it. Anyways, moving on, next we have Thread of Fury. Damaging targets with a tangle grants melee energy, gives -10 to strength. So this one is extremely strong as the melee gains you get back are crazy, and on Warlock and Titan you can hold 3 melee charges. I just love this fragment. The Compendium does not have specific values unfortunately, but it says it is a questionable percentage per damage instance. And the per instance is important here, because from my testing I can tell you that the more enemies you damage with a tangle, the more melee energy that you get back. Throwing it into a group of 4 red bar shanks got me close to half a charge, so it's probably about 10 to 12.5% per red bar enemy hit. Then I throw it into 3 yellow bar enemies and I get a full charge back, so maybe it's like 33% for a hit on a yellow bar. I then throw it into a group of 4 Cabal and I get about 75% energy back, so more than on the shanks. This would be like 17.5% per damage instance. So again, these values I'm getting are just my best guesses at interpreting my testing. I did not test this super extensively, but what I do want you to walk away from this video knowing is that the more adds or the higher the tier the adds that you can hit with the tangle, the more melee energy you will get back. So try and throw the tangle at a big group of adds to get the most out of this fragment. The melee energy returns are massive, and this is a must run with the Punchy Strand Titan build, or even a Necrotic Grip Warlock build. It's just great. Next is Thread of Generation. This states dealing damage generates grenade energy, -10 to discipline. So this fragment was nerfed because at launch it would give insane grenade energy returns. Much like Thread of Fury, it was well worth taking the -10 to the stat to get the big energy returns. The Compendium does not have detailed info on this one either, but it does state that you get a small return for each damage instance, and that the ability energy gains vary depending on the source. I found a patch note from last August when they nerfed this fragment. It said they reduced the overall energy gain per damage event by about 20%, and rebalanced the energy gain multiplier across primary weapon archetypes. They wanted to bring the energy gains for dealing damage with precision weapons and fully automatic weapons closer together. So this reduced the efficiency of automatic weapons and increased the efficiency of precision weapons to compensate. So you may say, Tizzle, what the hell does this mean? Basically, automatic weapons like auto rifles or submachine guns would get greater energy return than things like bows or hand cannons, because they fire way more rounds, and Thread of Generation is based off each damage instance. So after the tuning, this is more properly balanced. My theory is that this is still based off each damage instance, but maybe there's a slight cooldown behind the scenes. So a hand cannon would get that damage instance on every shot, but an SMG would only have it applied every like 7th shot or something. On top of this, it may also be total damage based, so a rocket launcher would get a big return when you land one rocket, where a machine gun would get lots of little returns over time as you churn out damage with it. And I want to point out one amazing interaction with this, and that is damage over time. Weapons like Dragon's Breath, Witherhoard, or Osteostriga are amazing with this fragment, because they are constantly ticking for damage. You can see in the background gameplay how quickly I can get my grenade back when running Thorn and Necrotic Grips. It is pretty crazy. All told, this is a great fragment because if you're playing Destiny the right way, then you should always be dealing lots of damage. And this means a quicker grenade cooldown, which in turn means more damage. Next, we have Thread of Isolation. Landing rapid precision hits emits a severing burst from the target. So this is just a really easy way to apply Sever to targets. You just have to land crits. The Destiny Data Compendium gives us the values. Basically, the more ammo a weapon holds in the magazine and the faster it shoots, the more crits you have to hit with said weapon. So a bow is only 3 crits to proc Sever, where a machine gun is around 14 crits. It's a pretty straightforward fragment. Next is Thread of Mind. Defeating suspended targets grants class ability energy. The Compendium shows us the amount of energy returned per tier of combatant. and the energy returns are quite large. So this pairs wonderfully with the Abeyant Leap Titan boots, because you can suspend targets with your class ability, and then you get a ton of class ability energy back when you kill the suspended enemies. And then you just keep looping this over and over. But there are other good uses for it too. Threat of Ascent Hunter with 6 Coyote is very strong as well. Next is Threat of Propagation. Powered melee final blows grant your Strand weapons unraveling rounds. So again, very straightforward. You get a powered melee kill and you will get unraveling rounds on your Strand weapon. I mentioned this earlier, but it does not work with Threat of Continuity to make your timer last longer. Threat of Rebirth states Strand weapon final blows have a chance to create a threadling. So the compendium shows us some values. It works like a counter. So for every 3 red bar kills you get, you will spawn in a threadling. And then if you're killing higher tier enemies, then you will have to kill less of them and they will spawn in more threadlings. So elites will spawn in 2 threadlings, and mini bosses or bosses will spawn in 3. And what is cool is you can run a hatchling weapon and these will stack together. So you can make a threadling from the hatchling kills as well as Threat of Rebirth. This is a good interaction to know about if you are trying to maximize your threadling creation. Next is Threat of Transmutation. While you have Woven Mail, weapon final blows create a tangle. Again, this one is very straightforward. Whenever you have Woven Mail, you can make a tangle when you get a kill with a weapon. Any weapon, it doesn't even have to be Strand. There really isn't much more to it. Threat of Warding is just as straightforward as the last one. Each time you pick up an Orb of Power, you get Woven Mail. Gives -10 to Resilience. So every time you pick up an Orb of Power, you will get 10 seconds of Woven Mail. And if you pick up an orb when you still have Woven Mail, it'll just refill the timer back up to 10 seconds. Very simple. And last but not least, we have Threat of Wisdom. Defeating suspended targets creates an Orb of Power. This orb grants you 2.5% of your super energy, and sadly, it has a 10-second cooldown. So you can't suspend like 5 enemies and kill them all and then make 5 orbs. You only get 1 orb. Then when the 10-second timer cooldown is up, you can suspend an enemy again and get another kill to make another orb. And lastly, we have Void. There are 16 total, and we will just go in alphabetical order, starting with Echo of Cessation. This fragment states finisher final blows create a burst of void damage that causes nearby combatants to become volatile. Defeating volatile targets creates a void breach. So this fragment is super self-explanatory. Finishers will result in an explosion making any enemies it hits volatile. And killing any enemy affected by volatile makes a void breach. Not much else to it. Next is Echo of Dilation. While crouched, you sneak faster and gain enhanced radar resolution. Gives +10 to mobility and intellect. So your crouch speed increases to 4 meters per second and you have double radar resolution. This is mostly a PvP fragment in my opinion, and it's very useful there, and the stat bonuses are always a nice plus. Next is Echo of Domineering. After suppressing a target, you gain greatly increased mobility for a short duration, and your equipped weapon is reloaded from reserves. Defeating suppressed targets creates a void breach, and this gives +10 to discipline. So this grants +30 mobility and 4% movement speed bonus for 10 seconds, and it will reload your currently equipped weapon. The effect lasts for 10 seconds, and it can't be reactivated until the cooldown timer is up. This is a pretty useless fragment because suppressing enemies is relatively rare, and the effect you get for doing so is not that strong. So yeah, probably best to steer clear of this one unless Bungie buffs it in the future. Next is Echo of Exchange. Melee final blows grant grenade energy. So melee kills on red bars grant 7.5% grenade energy, but higher tier combatants count for more. And the beauty of this fragment is it can be activated on uncharged melees as well, and it has no cooldown. So you can just melee to your heart's content. And on top of this, when I was writing the script, I was like, does this work with glaive melees? And to my surprise and delight, it does. So this just gives this already strong fragment extra utility. I'm a big fan of this one. Next is Echo of Expulsion. Void ability final blows cause targets to explode, +10 to intellect. So this causes enemies to explode, which creates a nice AoE effect. So if you have an ability focused build, then this fragment is great. And I want to point out an awesome interaction. This also works with Child of the Old Gods. The Void Soul counts as an ability kill, so this is extremely strong with a Briar's Bind build. Trust me. Next is Echo of Harvest. Defeating weakened targets creates an Orb of Power and a Void Breach, -10 to intellect. So once again, this works really well with Void Souls because they weaken targets, so you can activate this fragment a whole bunch. However, there is a 10-second cooldown. This is done so that you can't make a crap ton of orbs for killing a bunch of weakened targets. But every 10 seconds you can make an orb if you are built into this properly. And you also make void breaches every 5 seconds when they are off cooldown. So if you have a weakened based build, this is a pretty good fragment to run. Next is Echo of Instability. Defeating targets with grenades grants volatile rounds to your void weapons, plus 10 to strength. This is an awesome fragment as volatile rounds are very strong for group ad clear and even single target damage. Plus they can stun barrier champions. You get volatile rounds for 11 seconds. And if you have a grenade based build and you're running void weapons, then I highly recommend this fragment. Next is Echo of Leeching. Melee final blows start health regeneration for you and nearby allies, plus 10 to resilience. This one is very simple. If you or an ally who is running this fragment get a melee kill, it will start health regeneration. This can be great in PvP as well. But one thing with health regeneration is if you take damage while it's regenning, then you will stop getting health back. It's not a chunk of health like from Devour. Regardless, this is still a pretty good fragment, and it works with uncharged melees, charged melees, and even glaive melees. Next is Echo of Obscurity. Very simple. Finish your final blows, grant invisibility, plus 10 recovery. So do a finisher, go invis, and you can chain this over and over. There's no cooldown, and you get invisibility for 5 seconds and 7 seconds with Echo of Persistence. And Persistence just happens to be the next fragment. Void buffs applied to you, so invisibility, overshield, and devour have increased duration, minus 10 to the stat that governs your class ability, so recovery on Warlock, mobility on Hunter, and rezel on Titan. In general, this adds about 50% duration to your void buffs, so let's look at my Titan. I start with proccing Devour. It gives us 8 seconds on our Devour timer instead of 5, and then the timer goes up to 15 seconds instead of 10. So this fragment really gives us more forgiveness with Devour. Then we go invis with Heart Shadow and we get 9 seconds on the timer. Then we cast our Barricade to get an overshield and we get a 15-second timer instead of 10. On the Hunter, our invis dodge gives us 7 seconds and the Trapper's Ambush gives us 10 seconds. And for a little trick, if you dodge while invis from Trapper's Ambush, it refreshes the timer to 10 seconds instead of 7. So just a little tip. So yeah, the compendium gives the percentages of how much longer each effect lasts. I just wanted to show you the concrete examples. But this is an awesome fragment to run depending on your build. The forgiveness of Devour is really nice, but I find it most useful on Hunter for the longer invisibility. It is great on builds that are centered around invis, especially things like Omnioculus or Graviton Forfeit. It's very valuable. Next is Echo of Provision. Damaging targets with grenades grants melee energy, minus 10 to strength. So the compendium says that this only activates once per damage instance, so even if you hit multiple enemies, it only counts once. But during my testing, it was very tough to confirm the compendium data. So the grenades that linger give less energy back, but they seem to give some energy over time, as you can see with the first grenade that I threw. And then I tested this with Axion bolts, and you can clearly see me get 2 energy bumps from just 1 grenade. So I assume as long as I hit at different moments, then you will get energy for each tag. I'm not 100% sure on every combination though, but what I can tell you is when I used the Vortex grenade, it took my 1 minute 10 cooldown melee down to 50 seconds. I didn't time it with the Axion bolt, but you can see I get about half my melee energy back in just under 10 seconds. So it shows how powerful this aspect has the potential to be if you use the right grenade in the right way. So results will vary with this one, but if you have an ability spam build setup, then this one wouldn't be too bad to run. Next is Echo of Remnants. This gives your lingering grenade effects increased duration. This includes Vortex grenades, Void Wall, Void Spike, and Axion bolts. So the compendium gives us the values of how much longer the various grenades last. So I'll just show side-by-side comparisons so that you can see what it looks like in the game. And rather than lasting longer per se, the Axion bolts just track further and track for a longer duration. I tried to illustrate this in PvP as best I could, as you can't really show this in PvE. So next we have Echo of Reprisal. Final blows when surrounded by combatants grant super energy. The compendium doesn't have concrete info on this, but it does say you need to have 3 enemies within 8 meters of you. So what I'm going to do is once again show you a side-by-side of the difference that it makes. As is usually the case, this is a build-dependent fragment, but I will say it absolutely shines in ad-dense activities, especially with Doomfang Pauldrons on Titan. I made a build video with Doomfangs that gets crazy fast supers, so check that out if you want an amazing build and you like casting your supers early and often. Next we have Echo of Starvation. Picking up a Void Breach or an Orb of Power grants Devour, -10 to recovery. So if you pick up an Orb of Power or Void Breach, it will grant Devour for 5 seconds, or 7.5 seconds with Persistence. And if you pick up an Orb or Void Breach while Devour is active, then it will add 3 seconds to your Devour timer. So this is obviously a good fragment because Devour is one of the strongest verbs in the game. So if you want to build with great survivability and a form of health regeneration, then this is a must run. Echo of Undermining is extremely simple and extremely effective. Your Void Grenades weaken targets, -20 to Discipline. So it's simple, you hit an enemy with a grenade, you will weaken it. Like I said, it's very simple and very effective. Even though this gives you -20 to Discipline, it is often well worth it to run, especially on Controverse Hold Warlock, which is one of my favorite builds in the entire game, and it's been strong for many years now. It's just a great build, and this fragment is a big reason why. And the final fragment is Echo of Vigilance. Defeating a target while your shields are depleted grants you a temporary Void Overshield, -10 to recovery. This is basically the only way to get an Overshield on Hunter and Warlock. If you kill an enemy when you are in red health, it will give you an Overshield for 5 seconds, or 7.5 with Persistence. This is a great fragment for PvP, and it can be alright in PvE too. Extra health is always welcome. And that is going to do it for a breakdown of every fragment in Destiny 2. If you found this helpful, then a like and subscription would be greatly appreciated. Hopefully it helps you to better understand Prismatic when it comes out in the final shape. Thanks for watching and take care.